Across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, many Japanese pilots and sailors began to encounter a baffling phenomenon. American bases seemed to know in advance when they were about to appear. U.S. fighters were already in the air before attack formations reached their targets. Anti-aircraft guns were ready the moment aircraft entered firing range. Time and again, strikes meticulously planned to achieve surprise collided instead with a defensive system that was already fully in position. The issue was not that the Americans had more aircraft, nor that they reacted faster. What unsettled their opponents was timing. The United States appeared to begin fighting one beat earlier, at a moment when, by all logic, the war should not yet have begun. While the attackers were still en route, American commanders had already made their decisions. And while enemy formations were still assembling, the U.S. fleet had already deployed its defenses. Behind this phenomenon was neither luck nor intuition. It was radar, a technology that quietly transformed the way the United States perceived warfare. Not through firepower, but through the ability to detect, calculate, and act before the enemy even understood what was happening. And it was during World War II that radar enabled the United States to achieve something no great power had ever done before: to see the war before it truly began. To understand how the United States could see the war before it happened, and why this advantage was not a matter of chance, we must return to the decisive battles of World War II, where radar was placed at the very center of the battlefield for the first time. When World War II began, the United States was not the leading nation in radar technology. In fact, in the late 1930s, it was the British who demonstrated the technology's real practical value. The Coastal Chain-Home Radar Network, deployed beginning in 1937, enabled the Royal Air Force to detect German air raids early and organize systematic interceptions during the Battle of Britain in 1940. For Britain, radar from the outset was not merely a technical device, but the foundation of its entire air defense doctrine. By contrast, the United States entered the war from a far more cautious starting point. The U.S. Navy only began equipping warships with radar in late 1941, just before the conflict expanded into the Pacific. At that time, American radar was still viewed primarily as a supplementary early warning tool rather than a central element of operational thinking. This reflected a crucial reality. The United States did not lack technical capability, but it lacked combat experience to understand how radar should truly be used. The turning point came in 1940, when Britain, facing the very real prospect of collapse, decided to share its most closely guarded technological secrets with the United States through the Tizard mission. Among these, the most crucial was the cavity magnetron, a device that enabled radar to operate at centimeter wavelengths, delivering far higher resolution than earlier meter-band systems. This technology did not merely allow forces to see farther, but to see more clearly, a distinction of life and death importance in modern warfare. Recognizing radar's strategic potential, the United States responded in a characteristically American way, by mobilizing on a massive scale and reorganizing its entire research apparatus. In late 1940, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology established the MIT Radiation Laboratory, bringing together thousands of scientists and engineers, and concentrating nearly all national resources on radar development. Within a remarkably short time, American radar moved from experimental stages to mass production and field deployment. Yet, despite rapid technical progress, early American radar still suffered from a fundamental limitation: the absence of a unified command and control system. Unlike Britain's integrated air defense model, in which radar data was centralized and translated directly into operational orders, U.S. radar initially functioned in a fragmented manner. It could detect targets, but converting that information into effective battlefield responses remained a problem without a fully developed solution. For that reason, when war erupted in the Pacific, American radar entered the conflict not as a fully matured weapon, but as a technology still learning how to fight. Its weaknesses would not be corrected in laboratories, but on the battlefield itself where mistakes were paid for in human lives. The first true test came in June 1942. At Midway, a small, isolated coral atoll in the middle of the ocean, yet one that lay directly in the path of the Japanese Navy's advance. Here, American radar was not tasked with deciding the outcome of the war. It was asked to do just one thing: give the defenders enough time to avoid being struck by surprise in the dark. Before the operation, U.S. forces deployed SCR-270 early warning radar stations on Midway, along with SCR-268 fire control radar. Technically, these were the most advanced systems the United States possessed at the time. The SCR-270 could detect aircraft at long range, while the SCR-268 provided more precise data to support anti-aircraft guns and guide interceptors. Despite their many limitations, this radar network placed Midway in a condition few other Pacific bases had yet achieved: the ability to detect an attack before it came within visual range. This contrast became even clearer in the context of the Battle of Midway. In June 1942, the Japanese Navy possessed virtually no effective radar operating on its aircraft carriers or primary strike aircraft. Target detection still relied largely on visual reconnaissance, float planes, and fragmented reports. By contrast, American radar, though still unsophisticated, allowed the defenders on Midway to approach warfare in an entirely new way, based on electronic signals rather than intuition. As the Japanese airstrikes approached Midway, U.S. radar detected them early. This gave American fighters time to take off before bombs fell on the runways. It was a crucial departure from the opening months of the war, when many Allied bases were struck in the very first moments of an attack. At Midway, radar ensured that the United States did not enter the battle in a state of total surprise, an advantage the Japanese did not enjoy in the reverse situation. However, radar's role at Midway ended there. It provided warning and helped protect the island, but it did not create a complete operational picture. American radar at the time could not track the Japanese fleet far offshore, lacked the capability to direct carrier-based airstrikes, and had not yet been integrated into a unified command system. Even aboard U.S. aircraft carriers, early long-range radar remained crude, used primarily to warn of enemy aircraft at limited distances, rather than to serve as the central mechanism for controlling the battle. Meanwhile, other major powers revealed similar limitations in different ways. British radar proved highly effective in continental air defense, but that model had not yet been fully translated into long-range naval warfare. German radar achieved high precision in anti-aircraft fire control in Europe, yet it was not widely deployed across fleets operating far from shore. In the Pacific, Japan entered Midway with virtually no comparable naval radar system, leaving it effectively blind to enemy movements. For these reasons, the victory at Midway was not a victory of radar. The battle's outcome was decided by the breaking of Japanese communications and the precise strikes of carrier-based air power. Radar played a supporting role buying the Americans time and reducing risk, but it was not yet capable of exerting control over the battlefield. Yet it was precisely these limitations that made Midway a critical milestone in the maturation of American radar. Here, the United States saw clearly both sides of the technology for the first time. Compared to its immediate opponent, radar created a tangible information advantage. But if confined to early warning alone, it still could not become a decisive instrument in a prolonged war. 2 months later, that lesson would no longer be experimental. On an island far more remote than Midway, where Japanese air raids occurred day after day, radar would no longer be used, merely as an alarm. At Guadalcanal, it would be forced to adapt, to be interconnected, modified, and employed in an entirely new way, or else become useless in the face of battlefield realities. As a result, Guadalcanal quickly became the first direct point of collision between the rising power of the U.S. Navy and Japan's counteroffensive ambitions. At the center of the entire campaign stood Henderson Field, an improvised airstrip, newly captured and barely fortified, yet of vital importance. If this airfield were neutralized, the entire American force on the island would be isolated. A critical problem emerged in mid-1942. The United States lacked sufficient aircraft and pilots to defend Henderson Field by traditional means. The Resident Air Unit, later known as the Cactus Air Force, was forced to fight under severe shortages, with a number of fighters that could be counted on one hand. Every mistimed takeoff meant consuming what could not be quickly replaced: pilots and aircraft. It was in this context that radar, for the first time, became the decisive factor in setting the tempo of defense, rather than merely a warning device. In August 1942, the U.S. Marine Corps deployed an SCR-270 radar station to high ground near Henderson Field. This was an early-generation early warning radar, operating in the meter band, capable of detecting aircraft at ranges of over 100 miles. Compared to the tightly organized air defense radar systems Britain had developed in Europe, the SCR-270 was clearly crude. Yet in the Pacific, where the enemy still relied largely on visual reconnaissance and fragmented reports, the simple ability to know in advance represented a tactical turning point. For the first time, American forces on the island were no longer reacting blindly. Instead of scrambling all fighters, the moment an alarm was raised, a common reflex in the early months of the war, and one that many forces across the Pacific had little choice but to accept U.S. air controllers, could now track the approach of Japanese aircraft on radar screens, estimate their time of arrival, and choose the precise moment to launch interceptors. This produced a very concrete change on the battlefield. American fighters no longer loitered uselessly in the air, no longer wasted fuel and pilot endurance, and, most importantly, were no longer drawn into unfavorable interceptions. However, it was also at Guadalcanal that the limitations of early American radar became unmistakably clear. The SCR-270 could detect targets at long range, but it could not provide altitude information, complicating both anti-aircraft fire control and fighter direction. During Japanese low-level or nighttime attacks, early radar warning alone was insufficient to generate accurate responses. Compared to the fire control radar systems Germany had already employed in Europe's air defense networks, American radar at Guadalcanal had not yet reached that level of integration. The United States was forced to adapt in the midst of combat itself. To compensate for this shortcoming, the Americans deployed the SCR-268, a radar specifically designed for anti-aircraft fire control, capable of accurately measuring a target's bearing and altitude. The SCR-268 was directly linked to the 90mm anti-aircraft guns defending Henderson Field. While Japanese forces in the Pacific possessed virtually no comparable naval air radar system to coordinate their defenses, the Americans began to link their devices into an organized chain of response. For the first time in the Pacific, radar no longer operated in isolation. The SCR-270 provided long-range early warning. The SCR-268 took over at closer range. Information flowed continuously between radar units, anti-aircraft batteries, and air command. This was not merely a technical upgrade, but the emergence of a new way of fighting, one that Japanese forces, lacking both radar and a compatible command structure, could not replicate during the same period. The result was that, over the months of brutal fighting at Guadalcanal, Japanese air raids steadily lost their element of surprise. Japanese aircraft could still inflict damage, but rarely with the effectiveness seen in the early stages. Meanwhile, American air units, though still limited in number, were preserved long enough to hold on. The difference lay not in aircraft numbers, but in which side knew in advance and responded selectively. Guadalcanal was not where American radar reached its peak, but it was where U.S. radar was forced to mature, while its opponent in the Pacific continued to enter battle without a comparable system of warning and coordination. Here, the Americans learned for the first time that radar was not merely about seeing the enemy, but about binding that vision directly to the way they fought. The lessons drawn from Henderson Field would soon be applied on a far larger scale across fleets, in night naval battles, and ultimately throughout the entire Pacific theater. By 1945, at Okinawa, American radar was no longer a technology learning how to fight. It had become an inseparable part of the way the United States waged war. Yet it was also here that radar faced its harshest test of the entire Second World War. Unlike Guadalcanal or earlier naval engagements, the greatest threat at Okinawa did not come from surprise attacks in the traditional sense, but from a fundamentally different tactic: mass kamikaze assaults, launched repeatedly and in large numbers directly against the U.S. invasion fleet. In this context, knowing in advance was no longer a tactical advantage, it was a condition for survival. To counter this threat, the U.S. Navy established an unprecedented defensive system in the Pacific, a radar picket screen encircling Okinawa. Destroyers were deployed along forward warning lines dozens of miles from the main fleet, their radars operating continuously to detect Japanese aircraft at long range. Instead of waiting for kamikazes to appear over the fleet, the Americans pushed their eyes forward, accepting greater risk in exchange for time. This approach clearly demonstrated how far American radar had matured since Midway and Guadalcanal. Radar was no longer limited to detecting targets. It was now directly integrated into the command system, enabling early warnings, the direction of intercepting fighters, and the preparation of anti-aircraft fire in response to each wave of attack. While Japanese forces still relied on approaching to visual range to achieve surprise, the U.S. fleet at Okinawa was rarely caught in a state of complete unpreparedness. This system, however, came at a steep cost. Destroyers assigned to radar picket duty became the first targets of kamikaze attacks. Positioned on the front line, they bore the brunt of the pressure, suffering heavy casualties and severe losses. Radar did not prevent every attack, nor could it spare the picket ships from their most dangerous role. Yet it was precisely this sacrifice that protected the rest of the fleet. Thanks to early warnings from the radar screen, carriers, transports, and capital ships had sufficient time to deploy anti-aircraft defenses, vector fighters, and significantly reduce the element of surprise in kamikaze assaults. Casualty figures reveal a stark difference between periods before a fully developed radar picket system existed and the time when it was operating in a coordinated, integrated manner. Okinawa revealed the ultimate limits of American radar in the Second World War. It could not completely stop suicide attacks, nor could it eliminate the cost that had to be paid. But compared to its opponent, radar gave the United States something Japan could not possess: time to respond in an organized manner, even in the face of an extreme form of warfare, like the kamikaze. If at Midway radar helped the Americans avoid being caught by surprise, and at Guadalcanal it enabled them to sustain the tempo of defense in a prolonged campaign, then at Okinawa radar became the final shield protecting the entire war machine advancing toward Japan. It was here, above all, that American radar reached its maximum potential by allowing the United States to see the war before it happened. For most of military history, a battle truly began only when the enemy had entered visual range and weapons range. At that point, tactical decisions were no longer choices, but reflexes under an already formed pressure. War began very late, and often from a position of disadvantage. American radar changed this by pushing the moment when war began far earlier. Not by a few seconds, but by tens of minutes, even hours when the enemy was still moving. Formations were not yet deployed, and decisions still lay in the hands of commanders. This transformation did not occur in a single instant. It was forged through each battle, each phase, and each lesson paid for in blood. At Midway, radar ended blindness. The Americans knew an attack was coming before bombs fell on the runways. Radar did not win the battle in place of intelligence or carrier air power, but it changed how the United States entered the war no longer in a moment of absolute surprise. At Guadalcanal, radar controlled tempo. When there were not enough aircraft and pilots to fight a war of attrition, radar allowed the Americans to know when to fight and when to conserve their forces. While the enemy still approached targets through direct visual observation, the Americans began fighting earlier on radar screens, while choices still existed. By Okinawa, Radar had become the first line of defense for an entire fleet. Against relentless kamikaze attacks, radar pushed the starting point of the war hundreds of miles outward, allowing fighters to launch, anti-aircraft fire to be prepared, and the invasion force to survive. The Japanese only began fighting when they plunged into a web of fire. The Americans had been fighting long before that. The crucial point is this: when the war ended, the United States did not abandon this way of seeing. What had been learned from radar in World War II quickly became the foundation of post-war warfare. Radar no longer protected just an island or a fleet. It expanded into continental-scale early warning networks, tracking bombers, and then intercontinental ballistic missiles. In the Cold War, the United States did not wait for the enemy to appear in the skies. It sought to detect threats while they were still taking shape. From North American radar lines to global early warning systems, the principle remained unchanged from Midway, Guadalcanal, and Okinawa. Whoever controls the moment when war begins controls the game. Radar does not shoot down aircraft. It does not sink warships. But radar gave the United States the right not to enter war in a state of compulsion, the right to prepare, the right to organize, and the right to respond before the enemy could impose its own tempo. That is the true meaning of the United States. Seeing the war before it happened. Not to avoid conflict, but to enter it earlier, more clear-headed, and with choices. From World War II onward, war no longer began at the horizon. It began on a screen, and the United States was the first nation to turn that reality into the foundation of how it waged war, not just in a single conflict, but for the entire era that followed.